The following is one sub-postmaster's testimony to the Williams inquiry. It encapsulates many of the problems experienced by those appearing before the Post Office inquiry. The experience of Tim Brentnall shows how horizon shortfalls created by the Post Office's flawed software system led to the termination of his Post Office contract, the payment of thousands of pounds of false debts, and a conviction for dishonesty, which was eventually quashed in 2021. All Post Office counters operated Horizon, an electronic point-of-sale system. When it thought money was missing, it would indicate a shortfall, and if it issued a shortfall, sub-postmasters and sub-postmistresses were required to pay it. This is how it seemed to work.
So when did you start to notice shortfalls and discrepancies?
I initially had a problem in late 2006, which is when I then had my first audit, and there was a shortfall of around £6,000, which, as far as we could tell, had come from transaction corrections to do with the lottery that wasn't being accounted for properly. But the auditor explained that it was in my contract that I was to be held or was responsible for these, so I had to pay that £6,000 back into the post office.
Sometimes sub-postmasters contacted the helpline to see what was wrong and whether it could be sorted out. It wasn't always helpful. Sometimes it made matters worse.
Did you ever use the helpline?
I did initially, but I sort of despaired with it because you'd ring with a problem on Tuesday and you'd be told to follow these certain sequence of button presses to correct it. And sometimes it would correct it, and sometimes it seemed to make the problem double. And then you'd ring the next day and say, no, this problem seems to have doubled. And the next person that you spoke to would say, oh, well, I don't understand why you've been told to do that. That's completely wrong. You need to do this. Every time you spoke to somebody different, they gave you a different way of addressing the problem. And most of the time it seemed to make things worse.
How did you feel about that?
Well, because I knew I wasn't being dishonest, it didn't really concern me because I thought, well, I know I'm not doing anything wrong, I'm not stealing, and eventually it will sort itself out.
Large shortfalls could lead to audits.
How much money did you pay back in respect of that alleged shortfall?
Oh, got it down to about £16,000 shortfall before the next audit came.
And the next audit, you say in your statement, was in 2009, is that right? And I think you say that by that stage, having paid in, the alleged shortfall was about £16,500.
Yes.
How many auditors came for that
2.
audit? And what did you say to them when they arrived?
Well, it was the same lady that had been my manager, Gaynor, originally, and the lady that had done the first audit. So they were friendly. We sort of had a cup of tea and a chat, and she went through sort of her initial procedures. And then when she came to account, I took her into the back office and said, before you do the full audit, that I need to tell you what I've been doing, because you're going to discover a shortfall. At that point, I was under the impression that they would have been there to help me.
Did they help you?
No.
What happened after you told them about that shortfall?
Their attitudes completely changed. They immediately went outside and called through to their bosses or the post office. Before they completed the audit or counted anything further, they came back in and told me I was going to be suspended, while they found out exactly how much money was missing, in their words.
Audits, in turn, could escalate into an investigation. Several sub-postmasters and sub-postmistresses say they were told by post office auditors or similar what to do when investigators questioned them.
What happened then? I think you mentioned in your statement an investigation team arrived.
No, I didn't see an investigation team for about a week. They completed the audit. Before they left, Gaynor said to me that I was going to be contacted by both the investigation team and the post office HR manager, and she sort of said to me off record, don't tell them what you've told me, that you don't understand what's happening, because they'll accuse you of stealing it. Make sure that when you're interviewed, you can provide a reason to where this money's gone. And when you go for an interview with your HR manager, the best thing you can do is go with a cheque to pay this money back, so that they don't accuse you of theft.
Evidence on investigations suggests a rather aggressive approach, while post office interviewers also claimed a level of informality which they said did not require legal representation.
Well, I had a horrible experience with the investigation team. Initially, I missed a phone call from an unknown number. When I rang the number back, the investigator introduced himself as a man called Mike Wilcox and told me that he's not the kind of person that you miss a phone call from. I said, well, I don't know your number. I haven't intentionally avoided you. But that set out his attitude from the beginning. He called me in. He explained that he needed to interview me, but said, we're trying to get to the bottom of it and understand what's going on. It's just an internal procedure. We need to record it, so we'll have to do it at your local police station. But because it's an internal procedure, you don't need any legal representation. So I went without a solicitor.
Who was there when you arrived?
Mike Wilcox and a lady accompanying him, but I can't remember her name.
What happened at that interview?
They started off on the tack of accusing me of taking the money, saying, well, how do you afford to have a car? And when I explained to him the value of the car that I had, they said, okay, well, it's clearly you haven't spent it on a car. I hadn't taken any holidays or things like that. And I kept repeating to him, saying, well, I'll give you my bank statements, I can give you access to anything to show you that I haven't taken this money. Which they seemed to me at the time of the interview to accept. And then the second part of it seemed to be dealing with the balancing procedures, and why I had declared on Horizon that I held this cash, and I tried to explain the position that I laid out earlier, that I was trying to repay it to avoid having the suspicion of that huge amount of me of theft because of what had happened with the previous audit.
Several of the sub-postmasters charged with false accounting had, under pressure, been covering up shortfalls whilst they looked for the money and tried to sort the problems out. The post office treated this as dishonesty, but you can hear Tim Brentnall explain his situation.
In your statement, you mention a big alleged shortfall or discrepancy in 2008 of around £22,500.
Yes, that arrived as what they called transaction correction one morning, which you had to accept before you could open, that's what threw me into a panic, because I knew from my experience with the previous audit that I could be held responsible for that money. I didn't understand where it had come from or what it meant, so I just accepted it and decided that if I contacted the post office, they could well ask for that full amount immediately, which I knew I wouldn't be able to pay. So I falsely declared that I held the cash and tried to pay the money back with the view that once I'd corrected that shortfall, I could then go and say there's been this problem, and can we find out, do I owe you the money or do you owe me that money back? Whose problem is it?
When his case comes to court, he was advised, as many sub-postmasters were advised, to plead guilty on the basis that juries would believe the post office, not them. The hope was this would help them avoid prison.
think you say in your statement that your case for fraudulent accounting was transferred to the Crown Court.
Yes,
right?
yeah.
What advice did you receive from your barrister about what you should plead?
Well, still at that point, I was determined that I was going to plead not guilty. But the barrister explained to me that the actions that I'd taken with the monthly balances and signing them could provide evidence that there was false accounting, and regardless of intent or not, if I stood in front of a Crown Court with a jury and pled not guilty, that the high likelihood is that a jury would believe the Post Office over me. So he convinced me to plead guilty to the false accounting charges, because he said if I pled not guilty and was found guilty, then I would very much likely receive a custodial sentence, and my best option was to plead guilty and hopefully have a suspended sentence, which is what happened.
How did it feel receiving that advice?
Deflating, because if a barrister, either I didn't know at the time whether he believed me or not, or whether what he said was right, that he couldn't actually provide any evidence to fight it. But knowing in myself that I hadn't stolen anything or done anything maliciously, that I was going to end up having to plead guilty to it because I didn't want to go to prison.
Guilty pleas were often accepted by the Post Office only on condition that the alleged shortfalls were repaid in full, and sometimes on condition that the sub-postmaster did not mention horizon problems in their pleas in mitigation.
I think you say in your statement you paid the Post Office for the alleged shortfall.
Yes, at my interview with my HR manager, which either happened just before or just after the investigation team, I did go with, thankfully, money that I could raise, but mostly from my parents' savings, to pay them that to avoid the theft charge.
Tim Brentnall was given a suspended sentence with community service. It's worth understanding, though, a little of the broader effects on his life.
What about its impact on other relationships within your family?
Yes, I had strained every relationship. I mean, my sister was also running a hotel locally, and once people found out this had happened to me, they sort of tarred her with the same brush, that she might be untrustworthy and you know, wasn't to be trusted. The stress and strain of the whole situation. I was married at the time, and that marriage ended shortly afterwards because, again, it caused trust issues, but also, obviously, the amount of pressure and stress I was under, it changed me as a person as well.
What impact did all of this have on your mental health?
Well, if you'd asked me, I've said this several times, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, if anyone had asked me, I would have said I dealt with it brilliantly. But when I had the news come through last year that my appeal wasn't going to be contested, I suddenly had this huge outpouring of every emotion that you can imagine, and then almost slept for 2 or 3 days. Following that, you realise, looking back, how different. You know, you don't realise sometimes how bad you are until you start to get better, and you realise that maybe 2 hours sleep a night isn't the normal way that you should be living, and the stress and stuff that you're under. Yeah, it's a very rural community where I live. I was fortunate that when I was prosecuted and went to court, that I don't know why, but it wasn't reported in our local press. So people would talk and were trying to find out what had happened and things going on. And obviously, the rumours went round. But I'd visit the local pub and you'd hear, oh, "There's the fraudster," or "There's the man that stole all the old people's pensions," or things like that. So I just stopped going out, stopped sort of socialising.
How did that make you feel to hear people say things like that about you?
It was horrible, but initially I tried to challenge some people on it and put my side of the story, but people would always come back with, well, you pled guilty. If I was accused of something like that, they'd say, then there's no way that I'd plead guilty to something I hadn't done. They couldn't understand that that was just advice that I followed to avoid having to go to prison.
Thank you for listening.